Thank you so much, Professor Grimm. It's quite an honor to be in this distinct group of leading German economists as a modest area studies specialist. And I would like to start by saying, probably to simplify this long presentation, the central thesis of it is that the choices that China does in terms of its political economic trajectory matter probably more for the future of globalization and European prosperity, security, resilience than any of the measures that, for good reasons, have been discussed previously. So it's very required for all of us to understand where China is heading, and I'm trying to propose a few simplified theses on these points later. It's not new that China's global economic integration has wide-ranging effects. You see here on the right side different phases from the bottom to the top. That's the latest phase that we were able to measure. And one of the key features here is that China's trade integration in aggregate terms is decreasing, or is at least not as relevant anymore. It's the financial integration that has increased. China is still much significantly less globally integrated than Japan or the United States, especially. So the future of globalization will be different simply by that fact that the integration of China is much more cautious in many ways than what previous hegemons maybe have been driving for. Now, this is a chart from Bloomberg just a few weeks ago. Something pretty profound is happening in the way how China integrates globally. Total flows under current account are stagnant. Total flows under the financial account are increasing. So again, there is a major reversal in the way how China integrates globally. Now, a key factor why we feel these changes so significantly is that China's rise as an import substituting tech power has succeeded. So on the right side, you see China's trade in manufacturers as percent of China's GDP, and you see that compared to a benchmark WTO integration accession, China's imports have decreased significantly. Exports have to stay relatively stable. But also, we're past this peak of export-driven growth. That's also why globalization has slowed. It is largely a China factor behind that. Now we see that decline of German exports to China. Put it provocantly, China will soon be as relevant as Switzerland for German exports. Now, Switzerland is very important for us. But I think, again, that points to significant changes in the way how trade with China globally is changing. It's also the direction of China's global political integration. I'm not going to speak so much about this, but I think it's important to understand that there's a broader program when we talk about political economy. We can't ignore those aspects. It's a global political integration that definitely is looking at a different order, a different political paradigm that is underpinning it. And so we should also expect economic integration to be quite frictionful. We'll get to this. Sorry, I wanted to speak about this. It's not going back. The East is rising, the West is declining. That's the paradigm, at least a nice epigraph here, that the Chinese leadership is presenting. Now, it's obviously a large jump from that statement to these figures, but we see a significant change in the way how Germany's trade with China is progressing, with a massive trade deficit now emerging. We also see a reversal of trends in FDI flows. Left side is European direct investment in China. Right side is Chinese direct investment in the EU and the UK. I do apologize for the scales. So what you see here is roughly in 2024, it's 10 to 12 billion that we're investing in each other's economies. So that's quite a significant change compared to previous years. We had a previous peak of Chinese investment, which was largely M&A driven. Now we're in a completely different phase of Chinese investment in Europe, which is largely greenfield driven. So I want to talk about, taking this mantra of we need to take seriously what's happening in China seriously, about three, admittedly, somewhat simplifying aspects. China is really under stress. We're looking at very shaky foundations. and a crisis of confidence that will shape the next phase of China's global integration. We're talking about an engineering and what I call a systemic integrator state that powers on, so steering, control, also excess capacity, obviously, as a factor that shapes globalization. And finally, the successes of what I think will be the foundations of an alternative China-led globalization. We can't go through all the details here, but there's at least 6 reasons why most growth projections for China are fundamentally overestimating where China will be heading in the next 5 to 10 years, from the lack of structural reforms, decoupling leading to technology fragmentation, a lack of global demand, demographic challenges were mentioned previously, social policy reforms, which are being tackled but slowly, and the financial system stress that we are already seeing in China. So many of these reasons, if you go through the indicators, speak for a base case, if not a downside scenario in China's global growth outlook. I would also, I think we need to mention that official data paint way too rosy of a picture of where China is standing today. There's alternative assessments of that, and I think we can assess at least that during the pandemic and after that, there was a significant slowdown in the Chinese economy that is not visible in public data. If you look at the expenditure side of GDP accounting, it's simply not possible what China puts out publicly. We estimate confidence in the Chinese economy, as many do. This has been negative for the past 5 years. We don't think it's fully recovering these days. So again, we're looking at a system that is not powering ahead without any constraints. Now, this crisis of confidence that we see in China, it really varies across the country and age groups. I think that's important. So whether you want to see optimism or you want to see pessimism depends on where you look. So if you look at different age groups, for instance, Gen Z, part of the population is relatively optimistic. But I think what's quite critical is the millennials in Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities are really skeptic about their future economic outlook. And rural China, most economists that have looked at China's economic development for the past 2-3 decades basically say China's growth was built on exploiting the rural population. Again, we are in a pretty fragile domestic situation. China is experiencing the worst deflation of prices since decades, so 9 quarters of negative GDP deflator. That makes something also to our competitiveness if you add the price war on top of the currency devaluation over the past 12 months. That's a massive problem for all of us. Real estate continues to drag. Middle-class wealth is suffering. And it's not going away. This is a massive problem for local government finances. On the right side, you have land sales revenue. As you all know, this is central to China's economic performance and local government fiscal resources. You effectively have 12 provinces in China that are bankrupt. So again, foundations of China are maybe more fragile than we think. If you add to that the ambitions to improve social security, because that's central to expanding consumption, you look at a picture where effectively, if nothing changes, basic pension funds for employees could be used up by 2035. So again, major problems ahead for the leadership there. Is a recovery in sight? Not for real estate investment, which was, as you all know, at least driving 25 to 30% of Chinese growth over the past 2 decades, decade, I should say. And this is, again, quite important for us. I think the average Chinese industrial enterprise as of summer 2025 in China is loss-making. So the recovery in corporate profits that we might have anticipated towards the end of the year is not happening or is faltering again. So just to summarize this first point, the weak foundations of China's future globalization. Some see a sign of peaking China. One indicator here is the relative share of global GDP. It has peaked in 2023. I think we should probably, instead of speaking of a peak, talk about what might be a plateau, and the implications of that are far-reaching enough for us to take it seriously. Now, to the second point. There is something happening in China which we all feel, and I think this has received a lot of political attention. The steering, the control the industrial policy successes or challenges that China has. Again, not going into the details here, there have been assessments, that's 2019, of the size of China's industrial policy, the scope of it, and the support. Left is an assessment by CSIS, right is OECD and Rodin Group largely. So in terms of tax incentives, direct grants, the differences in interest rates, and many other factors, China is playing a different game. So that clearly has been part of China's economic policy trajectory over the past decade. Mind you, not necessarily before that, so this is a relatively new development. We've all heard about Made in China 2025. I think maybe more important than looking at what has happened with industrial strategies published 10 years ago is how China is adapting and adjusting very quickly to new challenges and opportunities. But we also need to recognize it is obviously possible for governments to identify industries in which it may make strategic sense to support industrial development, because at least in maybe 4 or 5 of these categories, China has made significant advances in terms of global market shares, etc. Now, what's happening today, I think, is more important. Over the past 2 years, China has really been brute forcing progress on strategic economic policy objectives. So real estate is out. What's powering ahead is investment in manufacturing, and accordingly the outputs, especially in high-tech manufacturing. So this is what you can do as an economic policy recipe to push through a period of domestic instability and global turbulence. And this is not neutral. It's a state-led signification of China's industrial base. On the left side, dark red, sorry, there's different reds here, but this is the state-owned fixed asset investment. On the right side is companies that have been invited to buy new Chinese equipment. So again, fixed asset investment by type in new equipment. This is obviously policy support program that goes into Chinese equipment and not foreign equipment. So the sinification, the state-led nature of China's industrial base is continuing. Let me focus on the right side chart here. While we see China's share in global manufacturing increasing quite rapidly, you also see the share of loss-making industrial enterprises increasing. So we had that level of loss-making in the early 90s in China, late 90s, and there's been massive structural reforms at that point. We don't see any signs of that happening currently. So China, again, seems to be betting on a different type of global integration where effective competition is maybe more important than allocation efficiency. This means what we discussed today, China's overcapacity, will stay. It's widespread across sectors. You can look at different indicators. Capacity utilization is one, loss-making firms ratio across different sectors. You will find those indicators for future overcapacity all across. So when you read today in the Handelsblatt that chemical overcapacities are now a problem for the German industry, this is something to take extremely seriously. There's no indication, despite the fact that the Chinese leadership now talks about involution, that any of that is going to go away anytime soon. In the meantime, what has happened is that China's declared vision, which is to make the world more dependent on China and China less dependent on the world, is becoming true. On the left side, we assess critical dependencies of the EU from China, which have tripled over the past decade. And on the right side, if you take this blue-reddish share, which was around 75% of trade dependencies, again, happy to go into the details of what that means for us. It's a pretty standard definition. Compared to where we are today, dependencies have decreased from 75% to less than 25% from the US, EU, and Japan. So a pretty daring picture for us. So given that industrial strategy, the weaponization of dependencies by China and what has now been called the second China shock should not be a surprise at all. We are having this debate now, but it feels a bit late, frankly, as things have been in place at least for 10 years. The evidence for unfair competition is very, very clear. You may, of course, choose to ignore it, or if you fear retaliation, ask your government not to act upon it. But the reality is we have pretty dramatic and hard evidence of subsidies all across sectors, from the EV to a study that we did for the medtech firms in the medtech sector. Now, it should make us alert when European associations point to huge risks for international companies in China. By the way, there's a significant difference between what the EU dares to say and what German associations dare to say. You might speak of a division of labor, but I think it's also problematic for us to work with these differences. So Jens Eskelund, a close friend, is warning of a train crash in slow motion, warning of massive overcapacities, inefficient allocation of capital, etc., etc. That's from the latest report. What matters maybe more for German companies is that the pressure on third markets is also increasing. So machine tools, the crown jewel of German manufacturing, China's companies are making headwinds here. This is machinery sector, revealed comparative advantage is a crude measure, but the overlap between what Germany is doing internationally and what China can do today is increasing significantly. Now, many countries are responding to that. It's not just Europeans who are raising tariffs, and obviously the Americans and others, but it's a very, I think, complex picture in terms of finding a global response to that challenge. I will skip a few points regarding those control aspects of how China controls rare earth exports, etc. I think the key point here is to assess that this is not just about rare earths. China is controlling technology outflows, so it goes much beyond inputs, and we're not prepared for that. I should end with, I think, highlighting that what is probably underestimated are the domestic foundations of what will be an alternative, possibly China-led globalization. First, so this is the latest figures by the IMF, industrial policy support in China is far higher than the OECD and EU average. This has been contested, but it's, I think, well established by now. An important point that is also underestimated is the extent to which central top-down policies have been increasing over the past 15 years in China, and how much central directives are adopted by local governments. So there's an element of central government mandating things that we are far away, obviously, from being able currently to implement here. Infrastructure, hard and soft, skilled labor, STEM graduates, the logistical backbone, all of that has been discussed, but I think we have long underestimated the economic foundations of what China will be capable of doing. There is a playbook to shape industrial development. I think from tech attraction to home market consolidation to third market expansion, innovation leadership, and then reviving global order, this has played out across different sectors. And I find it important to recognize that some things have worked, obviously, quite significantly. Jumping to and these are my last slides here, innovation leadership aspect. I mean, these are crude indicators, but 10 out of 15 leading academic research institutions, this is by Nature index, are in China today. There's one in Europe. 3 out of top 6 leading global innovation clusters are in China. None of them is in Germany. So again, innovation leadership, I think, is something that has been underestimated when we think about our future competitiveness here. If you look at China's high-tech catch-up, there's an expanding R&D base for emerging technologies. On the right side is an assessment by an Australian institute regarding emerging technologies. On the left side is an industry assessment that we did with ITIF. And so across many industries that we consider to be relevant for our future competitiveness, China is catching up rapidly. I would like to maybe end up with this way too complex slide, but the key point here being that China may be better prepared for the ongoing rewiring of globalization, because it has been de-risking for a long time. It has been diversifying away from OECD economies. It is really wired for resilience. It is seeking dominance, indispensability, and building leverage. So all the key ingredients that I think strategic autonomy would entail when we think about Europe. China has been doing that for quite a while. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Veronica, and thanks to all of you for letting me speak here. And I will talk about resilience in the shifting global order, but now I have to show my resilience. Okay, it's moving. Can we go back to the first slide? Okay. Okay, so I would like to start out with, what are the changes we are facing at the moment? So there are two big changes. One, the global order is changing and technology is changing. So the global order is, I think, traditionally the global order was stability oriented. We had a multilateralist, rule-based system, and actually it was based on the foundation of mutual interdependencies. And because we were dependent on each other, we had choke points against each other. We could build some multilateral institutions on top of it on this foundation. And we're moving away from this, from such a world. We're moving much more to a bilateral, transactional world order, and it's all about sphere of influences across the world. And we might have a bipolar or a five-polar world. We don't know yet what world will play out. Will the militaries be the primary driver and high technology, high tech? Be the man that's more bipolar, or will be much more a five-polar world, Herfried Münkler and so forth. That's one thing. And in terms of technology, and that's also with respect to the German perspective, technology was much that, you try to fine-tune the existing technologies. You make the existing technologies better and better, and that Germany is particularly very good in these things. And we move much more to a disruptive technology. Suddenly there's a totally different way of thinking about it. And in particular in artificial intelligence, you see that it penetrates that. And that I would have been interested also in the previous talk, to what extent AI will penetrate all the industrial processes. Now, the question is, is on the one hand, we had the stability focus thing, and I think now what we need, we have to, in this world where the world is changing, we have to have a more resilience-focused attitude towards it. And resilience means you are easy in adopting and adjusting whenever there's a shock or whenever things are changing. You're much more easy to adjust to that. Stability essentially means you withstand, you just stand there and get hit by the shock, but you try to withstand it. And if you are hit, you try to get back to the old status quo with all its own elements where the status quo is built on, all the subsequent elements of it. Resilience is different. It's much more about adjusting and getting to the new outcome. So pivoting is essentially towards the new. And that's much more adjusting and being resilient this way. And the question is a little bit, how can we as a society move and adjust much more easily. Individually, we can be very resilient, but we also want to be resilient on a societal level or as a whole institution as well. And so on the one hand, so we play with a lot with anxiety, and that's one way to recognize where the problems lie. I think anxiety is useful, but I think we also need a certain degree of a vision. But the vision has to be broad enough such that you still stay adjustable and can adjust to that. So in a sense, the way I always compare this is this reed versus the oak. The oak is very rigid, very stable in a sense, but when a hurricane comes, it falls over. The reed is constantly bouncing back and forth. Seems more risky, but at the end of the day, it's more resilient. But what's really important is that it has very strong roots. So you will have to have the strong roots of the reed as well. Now, of course, you have to be resilient with regard to shocks, but also with regard to shifts. So what we have much more is now we have transition phases. So it's not a single shock, like a COVID shock, and then after 2 years it goes away. It's much more that, we're shifting to a different world. Just think of artificial intelligence or the new global order. It's a shift. Doesn't happen it's not a one-time shock, and then it's a temporary shock. It's a shift. And then we have to be resilient to such shifts in society as well. And then it depends very much how fast is such a shift occurring. So here I've depicted a picture where I say, no, let's suppose it's the old global order. We move to a much more fragmented global disorder. And, there's a slow transition there. Typically, when there is such a transition, there's a so-called J-curve effect. So it initially gets much worse, and then you end up ultimately at this new steady state in the setting. But if this transition happens very fast, like it is done in this dashed line here, it's a very fast transition, you also have a J-curve effect, but it's more pronounced. And then you might hit a tipping point, and then actually you never come back. So that's where you have no resilience. So you might be resilient to slow changes, and that's also for choke points in all this, because you can adjust and modify, find new material. But if it happens very fast and you have to adjust very fast, society might not be able to do this. So you might be not resilient with regard to very fast changes. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about this, go a little bit more into technology and artificial intelligence, and then I go into global finance, and if there's time, I will also go into global trade, in particular in this choke point analysis, how to think about these choke points. So with regard to, I mentioned already, we have this technological shifts. It's not only it's a disruptive technology, but it's also a general technology. It's general purpose. It's not industry specific. You could also say, disruptive is also when you move from the combustion engine to electric cars. But here with AI, it's a general technology as well. And the question is then for Europe and for Germany, where's actually the value added in artificial intelligence? Is it in the foundation models, or is it actually in the applications? And it's not clear. And this depends also on regulation, how you set up, where the value added will be. And the US is very much focusing on the foundation models. They are investing this year alone 600 billion in the foundation models. And this got, of course, a shakeup with the DeepSeek in January. But the question is, what the optimal strategy should be for the European Union, given that the European Union doesn't have the same liquid, deep capital markets as the US has, and it's probably not possible to go that way and has to find its own way. And so it's probably makes more sense to focus on the application side and try to be in this sense. And in this sense, I think it's very similar what the Indian strategy is with regard to artificial intelligence as well. And there might be some collaboration between India and the European Union possible. The focus could be much more to say, okay, we focus on the application, but we also have much more in the data, so we change our data protection at GDPR, also the AI Act in such a way that actually we can collect this data and structure this data in such a way that we can actually take advantage of this data in a protective way. We just don't give it away to American companies in this sense. And of course, and I will perhaps go at the end, we can Q&A, we can go, technology has also a lot to do with sovereignty. That's, in AI, but it's also with regard to the payment systems and so forth. And I think in Europe, there's a lot of focus on the European Capital Markets Union or the Savings Union or Investment and Savings Union now. But I think we also need a European Payment Union. Okay, so this leads me already a little bit to the global finance. So how is the world shaping and changing and with regard to global finance? So of course, if you think about global finance, there's on the one hand, there's the currency, here the US dollar, and there's also the safe asset or reserve asset, the US Treasury, the US government papers or government debt. And again, the question is a little bit, if the US withdraws as a major player, who will step in? And the current philosophy is essentially US withdraws and China will step in. And the question is, will Europe position itself to step in instead of China? And I think that's very first order question we have to ask ourselves. Now, if you think about safe assets, the way of view about safe assets is, the dollar itself is a safe asset and the treasury is the actual safe asset. When the financial sector needs these assets, but of course the official sector is also holding, central banks are also holding assets, and that's then referred to as reserve assets. But a safe asset, I think, is probably best described as a good friend. An asset is, which is safe, is like a good friend. It's around when you need it. So it's a good friend indeed. And I think the good friend analogy gives you a good idea what a safe asset is. Whenever we go in a crisis, it appreciates in value, and it's also you can easily sell it. The liquidity is there, the bid-ask spread is very narrow, and so forth. The other thing is a safe asset is safe because it is safe, or because it's perceived to be safe. Or put it in different words, there are multiple equilibria. And there's an equilibrium where the US Treasury is a safe asset, and there's another equilibrium where some other asset might be a safe asset. Could be a crypto or something else. And so these are to have these concepts behind your thinking of what is a safe asset. The question is then also how to value this safe asset. Where does the value of the safe asset come? And we have, like usually we have, the price of a safe asset is just the expected present value of the future cash flows. But a safe asset also gives you certain services. Okay, so in particular, if you have financial frictions, it helps you to overcome some of these financial frictions. Okay, because you can retrade the safe asset. And that's why, if you issue the asset, you don't have to pay so much cash flow because the holder of the safe asset, he can retrade it easily for safety reasons. He gets a service flow from that. And that's why the cash flow, the interest payment, for example, is very low. Often it is actually below the growth rate of the economy. And if it's below the growth rate of the economy, you can also have this bubbly safe assets in a sense. So it could be that the economy grows at 3% and the interest rate is only 1%. So you never really have to pay it back. You can always roll it over because the economy grows faster than the interest burden. You have to come up with this. So in a sense, your current account, like in the United States, could be negative all the time. So it's just a mismeasurement in the sense that the US is selling the service flow. Oops. No. Okay. Where do you have to point? No, I tried this already. Oh, now it's back. Okay. But I have to press harder. So the US essentially is selling, not only goods, but it's also selling some service flows through the US Treasury. And this extra service flow is not part of the statistics, and that's why the current account essentially mismeasured. Now, the US enjoys this exorbitant privilege. It's called exorbitant privilege in the literature because it can issue these US Treasuries at a very low interest rate. And essentially, there are three exorbitant privileges. The first one is you have to pay a much lower interest rate because there's a so-called convenience yield on the US Treasuries. It's very convenient to hold them compared to other assets. And it is also okay, as I mentioned, you never have to pay them back at all as long as the interest rate is below the growth rate of the economy, the real interest rate. But I think the biggest exorbitant privilege is the third one. And the third exorbitant privilege is whenever you go in a global crisis, the interest rate on your government bonds are going down. That is, you can very easily issue some new debt. While, other countries, the interest rate is going up. You go in a global crisis, people rush out of these countries into the US, and then at that time, the US government can issue very, cheaply some government bonds and can run some stimulus program, while the other countries have to run austerity measures. And that actually is the biggest advantage if you have this safe asset status. Of course, the German Bund has this too, but it's much smaller compared to the United States. So the German Bund has the safe asset status as well, and so has Switzerland. So I think these are the key exorbitant privileges, and the question is, will the US give it up or not? And Harold mentioned in the beginning this Stephen Moran paper. They essentially were talking about exorbitant burden, and they wanted to give it up. They didn't understand fully what these exorbitant privileges are. And you could see this in the Liberation Day in April. So typically what's happening, you go into some uncertainty world, like the Liberation Day when Trump announced all the tariffs on April 2nd. And typically when this uncertainty happens, then the stock market tanks, the US dollar appreciates, and the US Treasury appreciates. So there's a negative correlation. And that in April, early April, the correlation moved in the opposite direction. So people were not rushing into the United States anymore. And you can see the correlation structures here. So they broke, essentially, suddenly moved in the opposite direction. And so that's got them scared. And that's why they withdrew from their initial trade tariffs in April, on April 11th, they withdrew from it again. So the safe asset status is now much more wobbly, and there could be some uncertainty about the safe asset status. And the question is, where will the safe asset status, which the US enjoys, where will it go to? Okay. Can the Europeans set something up so that it might go to Europe? Okay. There's an empty space, there's a void there. Can Europe step in and do something? Or will it be some crypto asset where it steps in and so forth? And the question is also, what you can clearly see that the safe asset status is much more the short end of the yield curve rather than the long end. So if you issue short-term government bonds, you still fly into the short-term government bonds, but not in a 10-year or 30-year government bond. So there is a clear shift away from the long maturity assets. And so the long maturity assets have to offer an additional risk premium because the safe asset status is going away. Now, one way how you could set up this thing, this void now, the Europeans could go in, and that's going back to some earlier proposal I made some long time ago about Europe, is to say, okay, the German bond market is too small. Let's set up a European system, which does not involve any joint liability. And this could be set up by any private player as well. You pool some of the European sovereign debt, and then you issue a senior bond and a junior bond. And what happens, if some of these bonds don't perform so well, it will hit the junior bond, but the junior bond will be protecting the senior bond. Okay, so the senior bond is totally protected, is a safe asset. So it would be a big safe asset provision by the Europeans. Because there's a protection by the junior bond. There's no joint liability. The protection comes from some form of diversification on the asset side and from the protection of the junior bond. Emerging economies can do the same thing too. Okay, they can also pool their bonds. So there will be potentially a different structure in global finance to move away from the US Treasury. China cannot really step into that because they don't have an open capital account, so they cannot really take advantage of these things. Now, let me jump perhaps over this. So what I can also see in the US, if you look at what are the dangers, is that, and that's also what the Trump administration is probably planning, if the US Treasury is threatened, they will impose financial repression. So financial repression means you force financial institutions to hold US government bonds. And this will be especially true for foreign financial institutions and foreigners. They will force them, if you want to do something in the United States, you have to buy US Treasuries, otherwise we put tariffs on you. And that's, was already indicated in this Miran paper, and that's financial repression. Financial repression is not something new. It was very popular after the Second World War, just to get the high debt levels down on that. Now let me go to global trade. What does this mean, 0 or 1? Oh, 1, okay. So let me just say a few words about resilience and global trade. Of course, there are different ways to form resilience. We can bring, of course, everything back, reshoring, but I think the more resilient way of doing things is to have multi-sourcing. You have sources from different places, because if you bring it back to your home country, the production, something might go back bad as well. And for this, essentially, you have you have to then say, okay, I have to be aware of some choke points are happening up, and then you can do some choke point analysis. So essentially what matters, and we have discussed about already, is elasticity of substitution. How easily can I substitute one input for another input good? And then the question is, where in the supply chain is it more sensitive? Is it the top or upstream or downstream? So where do you have to be more careful what the elasticity of substitution is? And then there's what came up in the morning and earlier as well, the time dimension. Over time, you can innovate and find new ways, better substitutes for that. Let me just move to the production chain. So here is one example. So what I've depicted here is a different elasticity of substitutions. These are these epsilons, and then then there's an EV car, there's a diesel car, and so forth, and there are different elasticity of substitution. So what matters is, what are the choke points? How easily can I substitute for one thing for another thing? So if the elasticity of substitution is infinity, then, then it doesn't really matter what the elasticity of substitutions are. But if it's very hard to substitute, so what upstreams is much more sensitive to that, except if I can then replace my EV car for a diesel car. So it does not only matter what the elasticity of substitutions upstream, but also how they interact at the downstream level. So there's a rich interaction between the different ways of elasticity of substitutions. It would take a little bit to go into that because you can have, you might also have some inputs which go in all of these different type of cars, and then it becomes much more universally essential, and it becomes a choke point. So let me conclude. I think we have a changing world order. We had an old world order where interdependencies were actually a foundation of the world order. So we had choke points against each other. That was very good. We had a balance of choke points, essentially. Now we move to a world where everybody wants to be resilient on their own. Okay? And then the foundation is gone. So we have a much more bilateral and transactional relationship. This might end up to a multipolar world. And then the question is, how fast do we move to the new world? If we move slowly, we can adjust. If we move very fast, we might, through the Jacob effect, might hit a tipping point, and the whole system might derail. So we have to be careful about this too. In terms of global finance, so I mentioned these 3 exorbitant privileges. Current account can actually be forever negative. It's fine because the current account is not measuring the service flow you do get from this. And what's really important for the safe asset, it's a good friend, but it has to be easily tradable. Okay, so if you put sand in it, like the US government announced at some point, we force you to hold this or not, that actually destroys the safe asset status. And the US, the Europeans could step in, also the emerging economies could step in to offer an alternative this way. And finally, for global trade, we have to do some choke point analysis, and I could only touch upon it very briefly. So thanks a lot.
Technology is with me, yes. Seems to be so. So I'll be offering some eclectic observations on trade policy today, and what I will be contributing to is a little bit more short-term and immediate than the big picture, long-term narratives that we have heard this afternoon. First of all, first observation that I find interesting is before the tariffs are in place, they already bite. No? So this is something that we have seen in the trade statistics over this year. The red mountain that you see on the left on imports, this is US imports. You see them spiking before the tariffs are there, and massively so. So, which tells us it's also nice for theorists to remember, expectations matter. So we had an import surge. And that surge had implications. It drove the US economy into a short-term recession in the first term, and then into a boom in the second quarter when that import surge faded away. So that's the first observation that I find interesting. And of course, if a big economy like the American has this big import surge, that has implications on other trade flows around the world, because you need to find those imports somewhere. The second thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is this April 2nd Rose Garden event that we've all watched, I think, with a lot of interest. It was quite inspiring, really, to understand also the mathematics behind those numbers that at the first glance looked like drawn from a hat, but no, there is a formula behind, and the architect of this formula was a grad school colleague of me, actually, so I know him, and he's a decent economist, which is interesting. But what, fundamentally, what I find interesting is something very deep about who is in charge of tax policy. When 250 years ago or so, the US was gaining independence from England at that time, it was, the fight was about taxation, not taxation without representation. And the Republic then has made sure that the right to tax rests with Congress, with Parliament. And so a very deep, I think, fundamental shift is that with Trump now doing taxes, and as a president, and tariffs are taxes, there's a fundamental power shift back to the executive, away from the legislative. And that, I think, is deep, and maybe something that has implications for for much more than just the setting of tariffs. But tariffs are important as taxes. No, the US thinks they will have some 600 billion tax revenue from this over 3 years. No, it's not a huge sum, but it is real money. And if you go back 250 years, of course, tax revenue was primarily drawn from tariffs. No? It was the most important source of government revenue. Now, some work of myself with Huotari at Philly, we've tried to understand how you can explain with our gravity model, with an empirical trade model, what drives bilateral imbalances across the world. No? And the assumption behind those numbers is that there's something asymmetric there. So trade costs are asymmetric. Tariffs or non-tariff barriers or preferences that just hate our goods, okay, these sort of things. And when you do the empirics in a model that does not have any place for those asymmetric explanations, you can explain 88% of the variance in bilateral trade imbalances. Okay, so we don't have to have those asymmetries. And these pictures just show you that the model prediction that doesn't have asymmetries and the data go quite nicely together with R squares of 97% or so, right? Of course, there remain those 3% unexplained stuff, and these could sit in unfair practices, but they are not in the trade costs or in preferences. They then are, in how governments run their, their overall fiscal budgets or their monetary policy. So I think this is, for me at least, this is a very convincing evidence that shows that, bilateral deficits or surpluses are driven by country-level variables rather than the bilateral trade costs or preferences. So the model is agnostic about that, no? But it's fiscal policy. So if you run a big government deficit, then of course you'll have a deficit with everyone. And then geography distributes the deficit across partners. It's about multilateral resistance. These terms in the gravity models. It's about monetary policy. It could also be about industrial policies that apply to all countries similarly. Then the next assumption, the next observation that I would like to make, it goes back more than 50 years, almost 75 years now, to the formalization of the optimal tariff theory that happened in the 50s with Henry Johnson. We often believe that, or the public often believes that the best tariff is zero. Okay, and then when a government like the United States comes up and puts tariffs in place, that must be a bad policy. But it's not that easy. If you want to maximize welfare, if you take a generic economic model where a planner maximizes welfare, under the assumption that the trade partner is passive, then an optimal tariff exists, and that optimal tariff is positive. In these early papers, the assumption of a large country was needed, so the country has some monopoly power. In more modern work, that is not even necessary. Even a small country can have a monopoly in a niche where it specializes. And so optimal tariffs are non-zero. They can be positive. And the idea is that what you can do with that as a government is you manipulate the terms of trade and you can extract rents from partners. Another way to put it is by taxing imports, you can essentially tax foreign producers. And there's no other, tax that achieves that so easily. It's a big seduction to do that. If every country, of course, falls into the same logic, then we'll be grabbing each other's tax revenues or taxing each other's our producers in each country, and that will destroy the division of labor and not distribute rents, no? Because we do this trick to each of us. Now you can take a modern model like our KITE model. That's the trade model that we have developed at the Kiel Institute, and we're using at WIFO too, together with Kiel. We can ask in such a modern model that has all these input-output linkages that characterize modern supply chain networks. We can ask what would be the welfare maximizing additional tariff on imports for the United States. Well, and it is something like 7% of manufacturing goods. So instead of having 2.5 on cars, they should have 9.5. Okay, that generates some gains in real income in the United States because there's tax revenue generated this way, and the EU would lose. And also the EU has an optimal tariff, it's a bit higher, no? If you ask this model. But in any case, the observed US tariffs are much too high. You have seen the numbers before. This is the reciprocal tariffs are no optimal tariffs at all, right? They're 39% on the table for Europe, and what they should do is 7%, okay? Now, of course, if you miscalibrate your optimal tariff, and instead of putting 7, you put 15 or 39 for Switzerland and so on, then this will be not welfare improving, but welfare reducing. Because if the welfare is like a hump-shaped form of that tariff, once you push it too far, it goes into negative territory. And that seems to be where the United States is, if you believe simulation exercises like ours. The next observation I'd like to make is about very fundamental uncertainty in this situation. This is the effective tariff rate since January 25. This is just a few months, not even a year. You see how the US has started out with 2.4%. It skyrocketed to something like 28. That's when the tariff war was at full rage between the United States and China. They had 145% at some moment with China, and 125 the balancing tariff by the Chinese government. Then this was dismantled. The effective tariff fell, and then as those deals came online, one after the other, the effective tariff grew. The August 6th event was the inclusion of steel and aluminum derivatives into the 50% steel and aluminum tariffs. Right? So now we stand, this is end of September, we stand at 17.86 an effective tariff. And that leads to massive trade policy uncertainty. This is measured by Caldera and Ali. There's different ways how you can think about putting uncertainty into measuring with data. But we have done a little exercise. We've used these measures to estimate what the uncertainty does to trade flows. It's not good for trade flows. And then this big shock, where uncertainty goes up from 100 to, let's say, 1,200. So it multiplies by 12. We can put that into a model and ask what would it do, for example, with exports of the United States to the world, including also Germany or the EU27, real GDP and so on, and the uncertainty per se. This is not changing any tariff, it's just the uncertainty is already welfare damaging or reduces real GDP in the United States by 1%. Now, of course, this spike has been temporary. It's less than this, of course, right? But for illustrative purposes, it's easy to generate in our models, a negative effect of this uncertainty increase on all sorts of things. I'd like to highlight exports, right? Because it's all about import tariffs, but at the same time, the models would say exports suffer as well. And this is something that the trade crowd knows as Leonard symmetry from the mid interwar literature. About a learner who showed that when you try to suppress imports, you'll be also almost automatically suppressing your exports, because what you don't import anymore, you'll have to produce it at home. And where do you get those resources from to achieve more domestic production? Well, you have to get it from those sectors where you have been a net exporter. So almost, to the extent at least that an economy runs at full capacity, and the United States economy is close to that, you will be having those negative effects, not only with imports where it's obvious, but you'll also hurt your exports. Now, let me say a couple of words to the Turnberry deal. Now, it was mentioned already here at the podium. The Turnberry deal is what happened on July 27 in that Scottish golf resort of Donald Trump. The paper that has been published on that has the title Reciprocal, Fair and Balanced. One can easily disagree with this verdict. I think one has to. The US increases tariffs to at least 15%, and if the MFN rates, the most favored nation rates, are higher, then to this higher rate. There are exceptions: aircraft, generic pharma, we've already talked about that too. Steel and aluminum, where they are higher. In generic pharma, they would be lower. Aircraft too. The EU promises things. It has not delivered yet, which is also interesting. It has promised to reduce manufacturing tariffs to zero. They are not zero right now, because it takes the EU apparatus to deliver. We don't have a king. No, we have, this has to go through Parliament and through the Council. So it takes a little bit of time, but it probably will happen. They've promised to ease market access outside of manufacturing, in services and agriculture. They've promised to purchase energy, AI chips, military equipment, and to invest into strategic sectors. And if you look at this, I can't do a full-fledged analysis of it. This is interesting. There's much more than that. But there are three things that are important. The one is it is not in line with WTO law, very clearly not. It violates Article 1 of GATT, the most cherished article. It's for good reason. It's numbered 1. You do not discriminate. That's what the most favored nations clause says. But here, of course, by having very different tariffs to all, so different trade partners, you do discriminate. Article 1 doesn't allow you to do that. There's an exception, of course, in Article 24 that does allow this, but only under certain conditions. And the key condition is the trade is liberalized in that violation of Article 1. Substantially all trade liberalized. Now, with this agenda, one country, one side increases tariffs. This is not a liberalization. It doesn't pass the test of Article 24. And also, of course, that deal legitimizes the breach of WTO law by the United States. Because in Article 2 of GATT, the countries say we have those schedules in the annexes, and those schedules formulate the tariffs that we bind ourselves to. And of course, if you walk away from that, that violates this too. And the EU, that's something that one has to admit, by signing up to such a deal, says, okay, you violate the law or the rules, that's okay for us. And then the third element here is this Turnberry deal does not eliminate uncertainty. Obviously not, because it's not a fully ratified piece of legislation, not yet, maybe it will be. So this sounds critical, on the one hand, but I would say it's good that we have a deal, because the non-deal is something we can't observe, but it's easy to imagine something much more terrible than what we see here. Now we have brought this deal to the data, and if you like, here's a link down there, the familienunternehmen.de. You did that for that foundation. You looked into NUTS 2 level detail, which we can do now with our models. And you can look at what this Turnberry deal does to your specific region in the short run, in the long run. This is the GDP, for example, close to Vienna. No, it's exports, I'm sorry. Close to Vienna, Bratislavski Kraj. This is where a lot of German OEMs have their manufacturing plants, where cars are built. The 3% minus. And you can look at Köln, Ford, Veneto, a lot of machine construction. We have the GDP also. But let me stress some other aspects that I find more interesting even. The first is, again, ABBA-Learner calling. This is a simulation that comes from Yale University on the effect of all the tariff impositions by the Trump administration. And what's interesting is that all this leads to some increase in total manufacturing. So the reindustrialization happens, there's something like that, but then within manufacturing, this is the blue box here, within manufacturing, the net exporting sectors must shrink. And the next net exporting sector here in this model is advanced manufacturing. So yes, you will have more steel and more furniture production and more shoes and so on, where you have been a net importer, but the net exporting, the high-tech sectors will have to shrink. Doesn't look like a very fancy industrial policy. And then overall real GDP falls too, which speaks to this over-calibration. So this, there is an optimal tariff. Other countries have not retaliated, so that fits actually. But if you too much of it, overall real GDP goes down. The second thing that I find interesting, again, this is the Yale simulations, but what we do is very similar. What the Yale colleagues do is they really run their models almost every day when new tariff data comes in, and it comes in very often. Right? So we have to push the button very, very often. Over the couple of last revisions, Canada has turned from a big loser into a big winner. Well, big winner, 0.1% GDP growth. There's no longer a loser. Why is that? Because much more trade comes in under USMCA, under the preferential trade agreement, which is interpreted, it seems, in a very generous way. And, that's a surprise. Mexico, the same. And also the EU turns out to benefit, not much, 0.05. Why is that? So to the extent that other countries get deals with higher tariffs, like Switzerland has 39, having only 15 makes European exporters think machinery relatively more competitive in the United States. So what we see here is, again, something going back into the early 50s, Jacob Weiner's theories about trade diversion, and we see it could actually be a chance for Europe.
Sorry, what is this, total trade or export?
This is GDP, real GDP, yes, yes. You see the United States again. For China, it's not good. For the world, it's not good. But to the extent that you have a better deal than the others, there is some positive in it. What all these simulations don't have is uncertainty, right? And that's why I showed you that chart first. No? The big caveat, uncertainty is not in here. Retaliate or not? Well, that's a big question. The European Union has been fighting over that over the summer, without clearly saying that essentially what the theory would suggest is that you do retaliate, no? Because the optimal tariff of the other country causes more harm at home if you do not retaliate than if you were to retaliate. You collect some money from the others as well. Of course, it would be better not to have any trade war, but that's what you should do. Now, this is just a screenshot of an older paper with a very simple model, and you have the best response functions of the United States against Canada here. So this is the US-Canada trade war, imagined like 10 years ago by Ralph Osser. And what's interesting here is that those best response functions almost have no slope, right? So what that means is you cannot hope as Europe or as Canada by setting your own tariffs that the United States would reduce their tariffs by much. They are negatively sloped, but not much, okay? So it's not that by retaliating you can reduce the other country's tariff policy, but you would grab some revenue from them, and that would compensate the welfare damage. And again, we've done the same exercise with the more advanced and more larger kite model, and what we would find is the retortion tariff of the United States of Europe of about 10% on agriculture and manufacturing. So retaliation would be from that one shot perspective would be optimal, but you do not change your opponent's behavior by doing that. No? So, and in that sense, if you were to hope this changes US tariff policy, you would be disappointed if that's true. Let me say one word towards the end that I feel is important as well. Much of the US trade policy is about old economy stuff. No? It's about steel, for example. If you don't have steel, you don't have a country. That's a phrase that we have heard already 8 years ago, and it has resonated with me. And what it expresses, I think, is actually something very logical if you have a zero-sum perspective of the world. If it's about if we are not in a positive sum game, but in a sort of a tournament where there's a winner and a loser, and where everything happens under the shadow of kinetic war, that always conflict could occur, and if you have a higher GDP, or even GDP is not the key indicator, if you have higher industrial capacity, you'll be more likely to win the war. No? So that goes back to old literature. It's a nice paper by Bob Powell in 1991. It's old in the American Political Review. And in that sense, this resonates. For us economists, it would probably we need to think differently about the objective functions that we believe in, right? It's not only about absolute gains from trade, but potentially also about relative gains from trade. So what do I gain from a liberalization or a restriction of trade compared to what the other gains or loses? If I lose less than the others, then this might turn out sensible, and the reduced form objective function could look like this. Okay, last point, and that applies to countries and also to firms. In trade wars, size is beautiful. Again, this, I can show a lot of charts that illustrate this, but this is maybe the easiest one. It comes out of some, again, a simulation exercise with colleagues, and where we shut down final goods trade or only intermediate goods trade, so that would be shutting down the global value chains, or all trade, then it would be an autarky. And the countries that lose less or least out of this are the ones top of the chart: China, the US, India, and the small ones damaged more. So size matters, and therefore, having Europe is good. Now, if we were to withstand that as separate countries, would be much more costly, and so it's good to have Europe, but it would be so much better if we had coalitions, alliances, if we had an anti-protectionist club that acts together in the world, that would give more size and therefore also more protection against tariff blows from the outside. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Veronica, and thanks to the organizers for having me. The topic AI is large. It came up several times. I think what I'll say resonates with some of what was said. For example, I'll go more in the direction of application rather selling the LLMs that we don't have in Germany. And I'll explain to you why I think that that's the case. There's no objective function here in the strict sense of economic maximization, and that reflects the fact that I'm also missing an objective function in our national policies related to innovation and artificial intelligence. Sorry to say, you'll see in a second. So, I'll go into some developments. Then there are, I think, failures. Sort of exploring failures is per se not a very attractive thing, right? Unless you can learn from them. So hopefully we can learn. And there are a number of opportunities. And at the end of this, there will also be a number of conclusions that go a little bit beyond what we have heard, I hope. The first thing is I want to sort of lead you a little bit into the history, because AI is not new. It's old. It's really old. It stems, if you want, from the 1940s, from Norbert Wiener, from Macy conferences, from wonderful conferences where at Dartmouth, for example, the term was going and so forth. And the initial phase of this literature and of this research sector is neural in nature or connectivist in nature. And people create out of radio cathode tubes perceptrons and other things. Our colleague Bernhard Schulkopf had a wonderful article in Süddeutsche Zeitung where he described this perceptron, which is essentially, if you want, 7 neurons switched together and the attempt to mimic structures in electronics that we think are happening in the brain. So what this graph shows you is yellow, the dominance of the neural paradigm, blue, the dominance of the symbolic paradigm, that at some point, after a vicious letter of Minsky to the funders in the system, read the letter. This is not the normal rational tone that we would like to see in our bodies. This is blood on the carpet. Okay, this is fight. This is Greek tragedy. This is not rational. And I want to convey to you that this is a field, like many other fields, where you have really fundamentally different approaches. I think fusion energy is one of those, right? Where people are behaving as if they are fiending clans. And then you see that the symbolic clan wins over. This is sort of the relative dominance of publications, right? That's the log of the ratio. Then at some point, AI winter and the others win back. And this is when vector support machines come in. This is when NVIDIA comes in. This is around 2007 when NVIDIA, at that point still a producer of acceleration cards for what my kids are playing with when they do war games and stuff like that. They open this up, they introduce a language, it's called CUDA. You can suddenly use these machines, and some people discover that you can turn them into high-powered computation centers on your laptop. And this is exactly what happens. Okay, let's follow up a little bit here. And the breakthrough then for this, by the way, in 2008, 2009, there's a lot of experimentation. There's some Germans there, like Schmidhuber, for example. And he experiments with CUDA and neural networks and so forth, recognizing Chinese characters, recognizing traffic signs and so forth. These are elements that are now firmly entrenched in autonomous driving systems and so forth, right? So what's gained there in terms of algorithm development is still there today. What came in then, in a publication in 2012, with Mr. Hinton and 2 of his postdocs. By the way, the folklore is that the postdocs had to push him to do this thing. They were convinced and he was a little bit on the fence. There you go, okay? And they show, very importantly, that with 2 NVIDIA cards at the price of $500 each and a PC, you can do something that nobody has done before in ImageNet, in classification of pictures of animals. That's the breakthrough. And what you see here is that the symbolic literature peters on, and the neural stuff, boom, goes through the roof. This is an exponential curve. Many people claim that they have exponential curves. This is one, okay? So, dominance of the neural paradigm at that point. And very interestingly, if you look at some of these examples here, Turkey, Iran, and a few others, you see that they suddenly engage very much in neural AI. Relative prices determine science. It's so much cheaper at this point to invest in 2 NVIDIA cards than in 50,000 K for a chemistry wet bench, unless you have an entrenched system where those interests are already present. This, I think, explains quite a bit there. By the way, you see Europe is on top, but we're sitting on a ton of old stuff. That's the blue stuff, right? And China is making inroads with neural AI, and the United States is catching up very, very quickly. There's a second paper 4 years later. So when this happens, okay, this comes out of University, Toronto. 3 months later, Google hires the whole team at skyrocketing salaries. By today's meta standards, they are small, but at that point, above $1 million apiece. Meta does the same. Amazon does the same. The whole leading scientific establishment is leaving academia and going into industry. The next breakthrough paper, attention is all you get, several of you know this. This introduces transformer technology, it does away with the recurrent and whatever mechanism that we're using up to that point. Watch those Google citations, right? This one is even more successful. By the way, in the Google lab, out of industry. I'm just putting that up here in order to show the paradigm shift, because the research is now coming out of industry. Okay, let's look at a little bit of who is who in AI. The first thing I want to emphasize is that China is ascending in all scientific disciplines. AI is one of them. You can do this for quantum, you can do this for material science, and so forth. Okay, and the statistic about leading research centers, and that China among the top 10, I think, has 7 namings, and Europe and the US have 3 and so forth, has already been put on. So this is not surprising that in terms of publications and also citations, just in case you thought that the non-cited publications all come out of China. No, that's not the case. It's among the highly cited ones where the output is, okay, is on top. Europe is not doing badly. Question is whether it matters. When you look at patents, by the way, don't be fooled by Chinese patent statistics. They will change at the end of this year when all subsidies to patenting are sort of shut off by the central government and the provincial governments. China ascending. Europe doing okay. Germany doing okay. Question again, does it matter? And my answer to that is no, not in the short run. Certainly not in the short run for science. This is clear, for patents also. Because if we had patents, we're not doing a lot with them, because we have other impediments in the system, in transfer, in technology transfer. And for science, the time horizon is simply too short. Okay, this is research from a colleague of mine, Neil Thompson, who has a lab at MIT. And Neil shows that over time, publications by industry at leading AI conferences, sloping upwards. The share of the biggest AI models, or the foundational models, almost exclusively industry by now. I'll show you at the end of this presentation an exception from Switzerland, which is quite amusing and interesting, and shows again that the Swiss may not only be able to repair their bridges in time, but also get large language models off the ground in a way that escapes us, sort of. So, even basic R&D comes increasingly out of private labs. This is not just AI. You see this also in quantum. You see this in fusion. Private financing of basic R&D is on the increase. I think that has profound implications, no time here. There is intensive rivalry in establishing these LLMs between the Metas, the Amazons, and so forth of this world, and fortunately also some European players like Mistral in France, and lately our Swiss colleagues. This here bugs me greatly. There is flagrant copyright violation all the time. Do not believe what these firms say, okay? You have to fight them. The New York Times had to take them to court in order to get a little bit of money out of it, and others do the same. The individual copyright holder has no chance in this battle, okay? And partly this has been declared now fair use, and then it's all over in any case. So academic institutions face a lot of problems, and we know that from the situation in Germany, where we don't get the compute capacity, the GPUs, the graphics processing units, which are now needed, no longer as two NVIDIA cards, but in huge server farms. I'll show you one in a second. So, brief overview of impact. I will not talk about ethics, because there are so many people in Germany talking about the ethics of AI that I thought that is superfluous. Let's talk about productivity and what it possibly means for competitiveness rather than that. I'm not saying that this is unimportant. There are issues of existential risks. There's tremendous issues of biases and so forth. I don't have the time to go into that right now. We do have papers if you're interested in that. So, 40% of VC investments currently going in AI-related startups. Now, every smart startup entrepreneur will say, hey, I have AI in my system. But even discounting that, this is massive. This is the strongest concentration in one technology that we have seen over the past 30 years. There's strong environmental and energy concerns, and I'm bringing that up because this morning with the CPR list that comes into my mailbox, I found this wonderful paper with a wonderful literature review talking about that, and I let Veronica take care of the energy issues in this particular case. I think that there is already a technology response. That's what I'm getting out of my analysis of patent data and so forth. And this is a very fruitful research avenue for basic research to make sure that the chips consume less energy, that the algorithms are less redundant and so forth. I will also not talk a lot about labor markets. Very heterogeneous right now. You have, 2 years ago, predictions like, don't go into computer science, coding is dead. You now hear that vibe coding is dead, and that you need as much correction for the vibe coded stuff than you gain by having ChatGPT or any other system do the coding for you. So, heterogeneous. That all sectors are somehow affected and all tasks, okay, which is the better way of looking at it, it's true. This is a general purpose technology. It seeps into every sector. It seeps into all areas, into science, of course. We know that. We did a survey joined at Fraunhofer and Max Planck and asked everybody who was willing to respond. I can tell you there's a vast amount of experimentation going on. The experimentation is so far that we have difficulties sort of going along with guidance, support, strategic decision making. There's a nice little summary in the Penn-Wharton budget model, which gives an estimate. I would take that with a huge grain of salt at this point. We have seen the estimates before, they have been revamped. It might as well be twice that much. I don't think it is half as much, but that's my personal assessment and reading of the literature. What you have here is a sort of a table that I also get out of the Penn-Wharton budget model because it's a nice summary. In my reading, we have about 3 dozen well-done RCT type, random controlled trials type studies that look at these issues. Let me take one out, which I know relatively well, which is the Delacqua, came out in 2023. They take 800 consultants from Boston Consulting. They randomize, they give half of them ChatGPT as a sort of a tool. And then they find, interestingly, that the more performant half of the sample, those who are already really good without the ChatGPT, gain less from it than the others. So this is one of the first technologies that I have seen that doesn't widen the wage gap, but appears to shrink it. Now, there was a counter paper on the table, a doctoral student at MIT, but that had to be taken off the table because it turned out to be completely fabricated. So, one more impact slide. And this comes directly, I think, from Irene Berczek's desk. And this is about what's the share of firms using it. And now we're coming to the LLM value added versus the application value added. As you can see here, I do, with an exclamation mark, make a point that this is a source of productivity gain in a country where we don't have a labor market, a strong labor market threat, because we have Fachkräftemangel. And at the same time, we have a productivity crisis, especially in our SMEs. So wouldn't it be cool to look at this and see that there's high application rates? No, they're relatively low by all means and also by international standards. Okay? And it's the SMEs, which are 60%, 65%, 70%, whatever, right, employment, where you don't have adoption of this. By the way, this is also the group of firms that was very, very slow in adopting any kind of digital tools. We're lagging behind in digitalization. That is one of the sources why we have low productivity. And that's why I'm claiming that that is a source of productivity gains. We have a huge debate right now whether we have an AI bubble. Let me explain that a little bit. When Sam Altman started OpenAI, 2017, remember, that second paper that now has more than 200,000 sites, in a Google lab. Google didn't get it. OpenAI came in, they took the technology, it was published, and they took it to the market. And they became the pioneer in the market with various versions of ChatGPT. Sam Altman has claimed a lot. For example, he has claimed AGI, okay, artificial general intelligence, which was supposed to come with ChatGPT 5. It's still not there. It's likely that it will not come for the next 5 years or 10 years even. Okay, we don't know. But it's not there because the systems have systemic flaws. And that comes out of their neural nature. And maybe we'll have to go back and combine them with symbolic AI or some other combination of hybrid whatever in order to get the hallucinations and so forth, which are in their nature Bayesian prediction errors, out of the system. But right now, they are systematically in there. So there's one big opponent of Sam Altman, that's Markus, who has a column making that point for the past 4 years, initially ridiculed and now accepted. And even Sam Altman says, we may be in an AI bubble. Why an AI bubble? Because the intentions, the invest, the CapEx, capital expenditures, these are plans that the Financial Times got out of SEC commission filings. That's a really, really hard research job. I couldn't do that with Gemini deep research or ChatGPT deep research. For this, you really have to go into the documents and get the numbers out, and they did that. And what you see here is that this year is 500 billion. But billions in these days, that's such a 2022 word. Okay, we're counting in trillions now. So this is... Okay, so I have a problem here. I like to run around, and but I let the micro go down too. So I'll stay here. I'll try. Okay. So what you see here is that the Financial Times, The Economist, Bloomberg, all of these are thinking about bubble. What would happen? It probably increases the prospects of AI being diffused because, boom, the CapEx will be devalued. Some people will lose their shirt. Everything will be cheaper. The GPUs will be cheaper. Even we could afford them then. And the diffusion of the technology will accelerate. That has happened at other times. We're now at around 4% GDP investment in CapEx at this. In the high times of the railway system, we were at 10%. In the high times of the telecoms preceding the dot-com crash, we were at 3%. But it looks pretty much like potential for some strife and, if you want, temporal disorder. I'll be quick because Veronica told me to be quick. We have made several mistakes in handling this technology in this country. First of all, we were among the last countries to discover that symbolic AI was not the way to pursue. Our Ministry of Research at that point, in 2012, was fully convinced that nothing should be done except for symbolic AI. and the neural AI researchers didn't get funding. Picking winners at the Ministry of Future is not a good idea. Picking winners at the Ministry of the Future is not a good idea. Second, production focus. Whenever we have an innovation or a technology in Germany, we run to the production corner. We want to be the ones exporting the stuff, rather than going into use, adoption, diffusion, transfer. If you compare the German national AI strategy to the Finnish AI strategy, you find that the Finns had in 2018 already a provision that said, we want to educate 2% of our population to be expert in this technology, which has a number of advantages, right? They can use it, they can talk to others, they can take fears away, whatever. You don't find anything of that kind in German national strategies. And I think we should do that, not just in this particular technology. Regulation, just very shortly, I don't think that we have the timing right. I don't think that we have enough leeway, space for research and for others to experiment. And I think that we're sort of heaping a lot of burden on smaller firms and on startups that large firms maybe can handle. Okay, here are the opportunities. I think that with smart diffusion strategies, small-scale vouchers and so forth for SMEs, we could do a lot. I'm pleading for Swiss movements. Switzerland seems to have a relatively rational policy. They're a small country, they diversify nicely, they went with IT, they went with digital very, very early, and they do that very strategically, okay? It's not all market economics in Switzerland. I'm smiling at Christoph, we have an ongoing debate on this. We need smart public sector strategies in procurement. We do not use our procurement volume wisely. And in the medium term, we also need radical innovation. Here is my Swiss example, leaving aside bridges. Apertus, a fully open, transparent, multilingual language model. It can speak Zürich-Deutsch, I think, but that's not the point. It comes in two flavors. It is open source and it's European. Do not put early research results or anything that you think should be confidential into ChatGPT, because it's no longer confidential then. You also don't put it in Google search, please, because it's also not confidential then. Or you do it at your own risk. With closed models that are open source, that's now very, very important, you can do something. You can harness the power, maybe not 100%, but 90% of the power of these models in an industrial setting. You can combine it with industrial data, of which Germany has quite a lot, or German firms have quite a lot. The last point is important. Let me make that, Veronica. 28th regime. The term pops up 4 times in Mario Draghi's report and about 20 times in Manuel Haidor's report. When I asked in a economics consulting group, not group, a body of experts, officially named, about 8 months ago, what they think of the 28th regime, it was unknown. And that is, of course, a reflection that it is a buzzword right now. Okay? But it's a very interesting buzzword because it says we should have a regime, leaving aside the 27 national regimes, and into that regime we can put, for example, an insolvency law, or a new legal form for startups, or some other things that I can opt into. And I can do that from France, from Germany, from Italy, and I do that only once, and then I'm in there, and the national regulation is out. I think that's a very interesting idea, and we should pursue that. There are many, many other points. There is potential for disorder. Please don't have national champions in science, don't have national champions at all. The old competition economics dictum is applying. When you're in early stages, don't bet on particular firms, bet on the topic, have competition, be complementary to sustainable strengths, for example, industrial data. I think that is a big chance for applying artificial intelligence. I'm a fan of an agency that has shed the Besserstellungsverbot. So you can hire people from industry, you can hire technocrats and say adieu to the bureaucrats and have decision-making that is fast and agile. okay? In the later stages, we seem to think in Germany that everything has to be financed by the state, even startups that are already at the size of 100 million or something like that valuation. So much better to have incentives for private sector money to come in. We could use our public sector money more wisely, and we could be a lot more European. Thank you.